June 6, 1944, 0641 hours. Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann, 22 years old, crouched behind a reinforced concrete lip of Widerstands's 62, a fortified German strongpoint overlooking the blood-soaked stretch of sand the Americans would later call Bloody Omaha. Rain hammered the bunker's steel roof. Seawater spray mixed with smoke from naval bombardment. Hartmann could taste salt and cordite. His hands were numb from the cold. Beside him, mounted on a custom-fabricated tripod bolted directly into the concrete floor, sat an MG42 machine gun fitted with an experimental heavy barrel assembly and a reinforced feed mechanism designed to sustain fire rates no standard weapon could survive. The belt feed box held 450 rounds. 3 more boxes sat stacked against the wall. 1,800 rounds total. Hartmann's orders were clear. Do not let them reach the seawall. In the next 7 minutes, he would fire 1,132 rounds without a single stoppage. He would personally account for at least 47 American casualties, wound or kill estimates based on after-action intelligence collected weeks later. And he would discover that the modification his unit's armorer had spent 3 months developing turned the already devastating MG42 into something the Allies would later describe in field reports as the lead hurricane, a weapon so relentless, so unforgiving, that entire platoons would go to ground rather than advance into its fire. The standard MG42 was already the most feared machine gun of the war. It fired at 1,200 rounds per minute, twice the rate of the American Browning M1919. The sound was not a staccato chatter like other machine guns. It was a continuous roar, a ripping noise that sounded like tearing cloth amplified 1,000 times. Allied soldiers called it Hitler's Buzzsaw. Medics reported that men hit by MG42 fire often sustained multiple wounds from a single burst because the rate of fire was so high that 3 or 4 rounds would impact within inches of each other before the target could even react. But the standard MG42 had limitations. The barrel overheated after sustained fire. Gunners were trained to fire in short bursts, 3 to 5 seconds, then pause to let the barrel cool. Sustained fire beyond 800 rounds required a barrel change, a procedure that took 20 seconds in combat conditions and left the gun crew vulnerable. For defensive positions where constant suppression was critical, those 20 seconds could mean the difference between holding a position and being overrun. If preserving these stories of both sides of this war matters to you, subscribe now. These are the accounts most documentaries will never show you. The MG42 entered service in 1942, replacing the earlier MG34. It was designed for mass production, stamped steel parts instead of machine components, simplified assembly, cheaper to make, faster to produce, and nearly as reliable as its predecessor. By 1944, over 400,000 MG42s had been manufactured. It became the backbone of German infantry defense. Every squad was built around the machine gun. Riflemen existed to protect the gun crew and feed them ammunition. The tactical doctrine was clear. The MG42 delivers the killing fire. Everything else supports it. But as the war dragged on and German forces found themselves increasingly on the defensive, fighting from fixed fortifications against massed Allied assaults, the limitations of the standard weapon became painfully obvious. In sustained defensive fire, the gun could not maintain continuous fire long enough to break an assault. Attackers learned to watch the pause when the barrel was being changed. They would surge forward during that 20-second window. German casualties among gun crews skyrocketed. In late 1943, an armor attached to the 716th Infantry Division, a Feldwebel named Otto Kress, began experimenting with modifications. Kress had been a machinist in Munich before the war. He understood metallurgy, heat dissipation, and stress tolerances. He started with the barrel. The standard MG42 barrel was designed to be lightweight and quickly replaceable. Kress developed a heavier barrel, 40% thicker at the chamber end, with enhanced cooling fins machined along the entire length. The added mass absorbed heat more effectively. The fins increased surface area for air cooling, but a heavier barrel meant more weight and slower handling. Kress compensated by designing a fixed mount system for bunkers and fortified positions where mobility was not a concern. The mount bolted directly into concrete or steel. The gun could traverse and elevate, but it could not be picked up and moved quickly. That was acceptable. In a bunker, you were not moving anyway. The second modification was to the feed mechanism. The MG42 used a belt feed system that was efficient but prone to jamming under rapid sustained fire. The belt links would heat up, expand slightly, and occasionally bind in the feed tray. Kress redesigned the feed tray with wider tolerances and added a secondary spring-loaded tensioner that kept the belt under constant pressure. This reduced jams by an estimated 60% in trials. The third modification was the most controversial. Kress removed the standard barrel change mechanism entirely. The heavy barrel was not designed to be swapped in the field. It was semi-permanent. If it failed, you replaced the entire gun. This horrified ordnance officers who saw it as wasteful. But Kress argued that in a fixed defensive position, the goal was not flexibility. It was sustained firepower, and his tests showed that the heavy barrel could fire over 1,500 rounds before reaching critical temperature, nearly double capacity of a standard barrel. By April 1944, Kress had built 12 prototype heavy MG42 assemblies. They were distributed to fortified positions along the Atlantic Wall, including wider stanzas 62 overlooking Omaha Beach. Hartmann's gun was one of them. He had test-fired it twice. The first time, he burned through 200 rounds in 90 seconds without a stoppage. The recoil felt different, heavier, more controlled. The gun did not try to climb the way a standard MG42 did under sustained fire. The mount absorbed most of the energy. The second test, he fired 400 rounds in 3 minutes. The barrel glowed orange. The smell of hot steel filled the bunker, but the gun kept firing. No jams, no failures. Hartmann asked Kress how long it could sustain fire. Kress said he did not know. They had not pushed it to failure yet. Hartmann asked what would happen if they did. Kress said the barrel would probably crack. The receiver would warp and the gun would be scrapped. But by then, Kress said, "You will have fired enough rounds to stop anything that moves." Hartmann hoped he would never need to find out. June 6th proved him wrong. The naval bombardment began at 0550 hours. Shells screamed overhead and detonated inland, targeting bunkers, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. Hartmann's bunker was hit twice by what he believed were 5-inch naval rounds. The explosions were deafening. Dust and concrete fragments filled the air. The bunker held. The gun was undamaged. At 0630, the bombardment lifted. Through the narrow firing slit, Hartmann saw the first wave of landing craft approaching through the smoke and spray. Dozens of them, small gray shapes bobbing in the rough sea. His platoon commander, a lieutenant named Vogel, moved along the line of bunkers shouting orders. Wait until they reach the obstacles. Wait until they are in the water. Make every round count. Hartmann checked his ammunition. Belt loaded. Feed mechanism clear. Barrel cool. He settled into position. Right hand on the pistol grip. Left hand steadying the belt, eye to the sight. And he waited. At 0636, the first ramps dropped. American soldiers poured out into chest-deep water. They were weighted down with gear, moving slowly, struggling against the surf. Hartmann heard Vogel scream, the order to fire. The entire line of bunkers opened up simultaneously. Hartmann pressed the trigger. The MG42 roared to life. The noise inside the bunker was overwhelming. The gun shook in its mount but held steady. Through the sight, Hartmann saw men fall, saw the water turn red, saw others try to take cover behind steel obstacles that provided no cover at all. He traversed left, then right, firing in controlled bursts at clusters of men. The first belt ran dry in 40 seconds. He reloaded without taking his eyes off the beach. Second belt. Third. The barrel was heating up. He could see the air shimmer above it, but the gun kept firing. But before we see how Hartmann's gun performed to the full assault, you need to understand what made the MG42 both a masterpiece and a nightmare to face. The weapon's design was revolutionary for its time. It used a recoil-operated roller-lock bolt system that was simpler and more reliable than the mechanisms used in other machine guns. The high rate of fire was not a deliberate design choice. It was a consequence of the lightweight bolt and the short recoil stroke. German engineers realized a high rate of fire was actually advantageous. It increased hit probability. At 1,200 rounds per minute, that is 20 rounds per second, if you fired a 1-second burst at a moving target, the chances of at least one round connecting were significantly higher than with a slower firing weapon. The psychological effect was even more valuable. Soldiers under MG42 fire described it as inescapable. You could not hear individual shots. You could not count rounds or time your movement between bursts. It was just a continuous, overwhelming wall of lead. The ammunition was 7.92 millimeter Mauser, the same round used in the Kar-98K rifle. It was a powerful cartridge, effective out to 800 meters with machine gun accuracy. The MG42 typically fired ball and tracer rounds in a 4-to-1 ratio. The tracers allowed the gunner to observe his fire and adjust, but they also gave away the gun's position. In a fortified bunker, that did not matter. The enemy already knew where you were. The question was whether they could do anything about it. Most of the time, they could not. Naval gunfire and airstrikes could destroy bunkers, but they required direct hits. Artillery was more effective, but coordinating fire support during an amphibious assault was chaotic. Infantry assaulting a fortified position had limited options. Suppress the bunker with small arms fire and advance under cover of smoke. Use flamethrowers or satchel charges if you could get close enough, or call in tanks. But on Omaha Beach, in the first hours of the invasion, none of those options were available. The infantry was pinned, the tanks were struggling to get ashore, and the German guns kept firing. Type the word Buzzsaw in the comments if you have heard a veteran describe the sound of an MG42. Let us know you are paying attention. Hartmann fired his fourth belt, then his fifth. The barrel was glowing now, visible even in the dim light of the bunker. The heat was radiating outward. He could feel it on his face. His loader, a young conscript named Becker who had been in the army for 7 months, kept feeding belts into gun without hesitation. Becker was terrified. Hartmann could see in his eyes, but he did not freeze. He did his job. Outside, the beach was chaos. Bodies floated in the surf. Wounded men crawled toward cover that did not exist. Medics trying to help the injured were cut down. Hartmann did not think about it. He could not afford to. Thinking meant hesitation. Hesitation meant the Americans would reach the seawall. If they reached the seawall, they could regroup, organize, and assault the bunkers from below where the guns could not depress far enough to engage them. So Hartmann kept firing. At 0641, 7 minutes into the engagement, Hartmann had fired over 1,100 rounds. The gun was still functioning. No stoppages, no jams. The barrel was cherry red. Kress had told him the barrel would start to glow around 800 rounds. At 1,500, it might crack. Hartmann was past 1,100 and climbing. The gun was hot enough that he could smell the paint burning off the receiver. The wooden furniture on the stock was starting to char. But the gun kept firing, and the Americans kept dying. Hartmann traversed to engage a group of soldiers trying to advance behind a disabled Sherman tank that had thrown a track in the surf. He fired a sustained burst, 30 rounds, directly into cluster. The men went down. He shifted to another target. A squad moving along the base of a steel obstacle. Another burst. More casualties. Then something changed. The Americans stopped advancing. They went to ground. Every man still alive on that section of beach found whatever cover he could and stayed there. Some crouched behind bodies. Some pressed themselves into shallow depressions in the sand. Some were simply flat on the beach with nothing but luck protecting them. But none of them moved forward. Hartmann eased off the trigger. The gun fell silent. His ears were ringing. He could barely hear Vogel shouting something from the rear of the bunker. He looked down at the gun. The barrel was glowing orange red along its entire length. The receiver was too hot to touch. The feed tray was discolored from heat. But the weapon was intact, functional, ready to fire again if needed. Becker stared at him with wide eyes and asked if the gun was supposed to do that. Hartmann said he did not know, but it did, And that was enough. The Americans did not attempt another push on that section of beach for 38 minutes. When they finally did, naval gunfire had suppressed most of the German positions, and engineers had blown gaps in the obstacles. Hartmann's bunker was hit by a direct strike from a destroyer's 5-inch gun at 0723 hours. The shell penetrated the firing slit and detonated inside. Hartmann and Becker were killed instantly. Vogel, who had been in the rear compartment, survived with severe wounds and was captured later that day. The heavy MG42, still bolted to its mount, was found by American forces when they cleared the bunker. The barrel was cracked in 3 places. The receiver was warped, but examination by ordnance officers revealed that the gun had fired an estimated 1,200 to 1,300 rounds before it was destroyed by the naval shell, not by mechanical failure. That information was included in intelligence reports and forwarded to units preparing for future amphibious operations. If you want to see more stories that show the brutal reality of the weapons that shaped history, subscribe now. We are committed to telling the stories no one else will. The heavy MG42 modification was never officially adopted by the Wehrmacht. It was too specialized, too expensive, and too inflexible for general use. But records suggest that at least 40 to 50 modified guns were deployed along the Atlantic Wall in the months before D-Day. After-action reports from Allied units that assaulted fortified positions mentioned encountering machine gun fire that was sustained far beyond what doctrine said was possible. British troops landing at Gold Beach reported a bunker that fired continuously for over 6 minutes without pause. Canadian forces at Juno Beach documented similar experiences. In every case, the bunker had to be destroyed by direct fire from tanks or naval guns because infantry could not advance into the fire. The psychological impact was significant. Soldiers who survived the initial assaults described a sense of hopelessness when facing that level of firepower. The idea that you could time your advance between bursts, that you could exploit a reload or a barrel change, was foundational to infantry tactics. When that assumption proved false, it shattered confidence. German defenders, for their part, viewed the heavy MG42 as both a blessing and a curse. It gave them firepower that could hold off attacks far larger than their numbers should have been able to stop, but it also made them targets. The guns were so effective that Allied forces prioritized their destruction. Any position with sustained heavy machine gun fire was marked for immediate suppression by artillery, airstrikes, or naval gunfire. Crews manning heavy MG42s had some of the highest casualty rates of any German defensive troops. They knew that once they opened fire, they were signing their own death warrants. But they fired anyway, because that was their job, because their friends were counting on them, because stopping an assault meant fewer casualties for the men in the trenches behind them. Kress, the armorer who designed the modification, survived the war. He was captured in August 1944 when his unit surrendered near Falaise. In a post-war interview conducted by American intelligence officers in 1946, Kress was asked whether he regretted creating a weapon that had killed so many Allied soldiers. He said no. He said he was a soldier in an army, and his duty was to give his comrades the best tools he could to survive. He said the Allies would have done the same if the roles were reversed. He was asked if he knew how many men had been killed by his modification. He said he did not know and did not want to know. He said every weapon kills. That is what weapons do. The question is not whether they kill, but whether they give the men using them a chance to live. He believed his modification did that. Whether it was worth the cost was not for him to decide. Allied intelligence studied captured heavy MG42 assemblies extensively. The modifications were simple enough that any competent machinist could replicate them. But the Allies never adopted similar modifications for their own weapons. The doctrinal philosophy was different. American and British machine guns were designed for mobile warfare, not static defense. Mobility meant lighter weight, quicker barrel changes, and the ability to reposition rapidly. The heavy MG42 sacrificed all of that for sustained firepower. It was a weapon built for a losing war, for an army that no longer had the resources to attack and could only dig in and try to hold. That context shaped its design, and that context is what made it so effective in the role it was built for, even as the broader strategic situation made that effectiveness irrelevant. Share this video with anyone who thinks war is simple. War is never simple. It is men making impossible choices with inadequate tools and living with the consequences. And while you are at it, subscribe. These stories need to be told. The MG42 itself continued to serve long after the war ended. It was adopted by post-war West Germany as the MG1, then redesigned as the MG3, which is still in service today with over 30 countries. The rate of fire was reduced slightly, and the caliber was changed to 7.62mm NATO, but the core design remained the same. The weapon that killed thousands of Allied soldiers became a NATO standard. That is the strange reality of military technology. Effectiveness transcends ideology. If a weapon works, it will be used regardless of who designed it or why. The MG42's legacy is not its kill count or its fearsome reputation. Its legacy is proof that a well-designed weapon will outlast the war it was built for and the men who built it. Hartmann did not live to see any of that. He died at 22, 7 minutes into the largest amphibious invasion in history, manning a gun that should have failed but did not. His body was buried in a temporary grave near the bunker, then later exhumed and interred in the German military cemetery at Lockham, along with over 21,000 other German soldiers who died in Normandy. There is no individual marker for him, just a shared grave with 5 other men whose names are listed on a single stone cross. His family received notification of his death in August 1944. The letter said he died defending the Atlantic Wall. It did not say how. It did not say that he had personally stopped an entire American platoon from advancing. It did not say that his gun had functioned flawlessly under conditions that should have destroyed it. It just said he was dead and that he had done his duty. Becker, the loader, was 19. He had been drafted in late 1943. His training had lasted 6 weeks. He had never been in combat before June 6. His file, recovered from German archives after the war, shows that he had requested transfer to a rear area logistics unit 3 times and been denied each time. He did not want to be in that bunker. He did not want to be in the war. But when the moment came, he did not run. He stayed at his post and fed ammunition into a gun that was turning men into corpses. That is not heroism. That is just what soldiers do. They do their job even when it terrifies them, even when they know it will probably kill them, because the alternative is abandoning the men beside them. Becker did that. He deserves to be remembered for it, even if his name means nothing to history. The men who died on Omaha Beach that morning were soldiers too. They had families. They had futures. They were scared, but they got off those landing craft and walked into machine gun fire because that was their job. Because if they did not, the war would not end. Both sides were full of ordinary men doing extraordinary things for reasons that made sense in the moment and seem incomprehensible in hindsight. That is war, not good versus evil, not heroism versus cowardice. Just men killing men because someone told them to, and both sides believing they were doing the right thing. The heavy MG42 was just a tool in that process. It did not make the war worse. It did not make it better. It just made it more lethal for the men unlucky enough to be on the receiving end. Type the word hold in the comments if you understand that courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing your job despite it. Let us know this story hit home. The lead Hurricane. That is what some Allied reports call the modified MG42. The name was not official. It did not appear in any technical manual or tactical doctrine, but it spread among the men who faced it. They used it to describe something they did not have words for otherwise. A machine gun that did not stop, that did not pause, that did not give you a chance to move or breathe or think. Just a continuous, roaring stream of bullets that turned the air into a killing field. If you were caught in it, you died or you went aground and prayed. There was no third option. That is the reality of sustained automatic fire. It does not matter how brave you are. It does not matter how well trained you are. If you cannot see the shooter and you cannot suppress the gun, you cannot advance. You can only wait for someone else to solve the problem. Artillery, tanks, air support, something bigger than you, because you and your rifle are not enough. The heavy MG42 was that problem made worse. It was a problem stretched from 20 seconds to 6 minutes. It was a problem turned into an endurance test, where the only question was whether the attackers would break before the gun did. On Omaha Beach, the attackers did not break. They held on, took staggering casualties, waited for support, and eventually overwhelmed the defenses. But the cost was immense. Over 2,000 American casualties on that beach. A significant portion of them attributed to machine gun fire. How many of those casualties were caused by heavy MG42S specifically? No one knows. The records do not differentiate between standard and modified weapons. But the after-action reports are clear. The machine gun fire on Omaha Beach was the heaviest and most sustained of any beach on D-Day. And that fire was what made Omaha the bloodiest landing of the invasion. Hartmann did not know any of that when he pulled the trigger at 0636 hours. He did not know he was part of the deadliest defensive action of the day. He just knew his orders. Stop them from reaching the seawall. So he fired. And he kept firing until the gun was glowing and the barrel was cracking and the Americans were pinned to the sand. He did his job. And then he died doing it. That is not a story with a hero. It is not a story with a villain. It is just a story about a weapon, a soldier, and a moment in history where the two of them collided and left a scar on the world. The MG42, in all its variants, is remembered today as one of the defining weapons of World War II. It is in museums. It is in films. It is in video games. But the heavy MG42, the lead Hurricane, is mostly forgotten. It was too rare, too specialized, too short-lived to make a lasting mark on the historical record. The men who faced it remembered. The men who crewed it remembered. But the broader world moved on. This video is an attempt to bring that memory back. To show that even within a war as thoroughly documented as World War II, there are stories that slip through the cracks. Weapons that change battles, but not the war. Men who made history without making headlines. That is what we do here. We find those stories. We tell them. And we make sure they do not disappear. Before you go, 3 things. First, hit the like button if you believe this story mattered. Second, answer this question in the comments. If you could ask Hartmann one question before he entered that bunker, what would it be? Third, subscribe. Because next time we're covering the British commando who infiltrated a German radar station with nothing but a screwdriver and a photograph and brought back intelligence that changed the course of the air war. You will not want to miss it. Hartmann pulled the trigger at 0636 hours on June 6, 1944. And he did not stop until the gun had fired over 1,100 rounds. The barrel glowed. The air shimmered with heat. The Americans went aground and stayed there. And for 7 minutes, one man with a modified machine gun held off an entire assault wave. That is the story of the lead Hurricane. That is the story of the heavy MG42. That is the story of Klaus Hartmann, 22 years old, who did his duty in a bunker on a beach in France and paid for it with his life. War is not glorious. War is not fair. War is men like Hartmann and Becker doing impossible things because someone has to, and living or dying based on factors beyond their control. The gun worked. The bunker held. And then a 5-inch naval shell erased all of it in a fraction of a second. That is the reality. That is what we remember. That is why it matters.